Everybody, welcome to the show. Joe Wrote, welcome to Last Chance to See. He's got, if you're not familiar with him already, he's got a great Substack. He's a very fun follow on Twitter. And you guys, if you're not familiar, you should get familiar with this stuff because it's great. Thanks for coming on, Joe.
Thanks for having me, Emil. Happy to be here.
Yeah, and really want to talk to you about a few things. Want to get into some of your recent writing on the ascendant left we're seeing, whether it's something we can genuinely get excited about, or if it's I don't know how these things normally go, and then want to talk about, in conjunction with that, the kind of the battle for what the Democratic Party means going forward, and then towards the end we'll talk about whether or not some of these cracks in the MAGA foundation are real, and if I don't know if we're going to start seeing a different right-wing thread.
Yeah, sounds good. No shortage of discussion topic.
Yeah. I want to jump in with this kind of this new left we're seeing. You wrote, maybe it's better off to just let you kind of explain your perspective here a little bit. You wrote a great article called "The Left is Off the Sidelines," and maybe you could explain what you mean by that.
Definitely. So, it has not been the most fun to be a leftist over the last 10, 20 years in the United States, and probably even before that, right? Have not always had the most success. Our ideas are very far from power. That leads to a lot of frustration, a lot of really hard questions about how do we deal with the Democratic Party in which our values are not even apparent. And of course, on the other side, you have the threat of Republican fascism, right? And what I really see in not just Zoran Mamdani's victory, but in across the country, is that the left is kind of growing out of that, right? We're no longer just protesters and activist groups, right? We have real politicians in real places of power. New York City mayor is, of course, a mayor. It's technically a local office, but that is a huge, globally recognized position, right? Look at Eric Adams, right? He just got a whole visit to Israel, and he's like praying on the Western Wall and stuff.
Well, Tel Aviv is the New York City of Israel, as they say.
Yeah, the sixth borough apparently. But that's like because he's the mayor of New York City, he's not just some guy, right? And now that position will be held by the Democratic Socialists of America in a couple months, right? So similar progress in Seattle, right? Katie Wilson ran and won a tight race, and then this is always vague, but like leftist candidates, right? People from Communist Party, Greens, Working Families Party, DSA won a ton of city council seats over on the election night, which really got overshadowed and everything. And so what I really want, leftists to recognize is, like you said at the beginning, we've all been burned before, right? Either our politicians don't turn out to be what we want, or they're just ineffective and they lose.
Or totally rat fucked by the Democratic machine.
Absolutely, right? We've gotten our hopes up more times than I care to admit. And I do think that that, is absolutely something people should keep in mind and be on guard. And I actually liked, he's no socialist, but what Graham Plattner said when somebody asked him, are you the next John Fetterman? He's like, I'm not, but it makes absolute sense that you would think I am, because that's how a lot of stuff has gone. A supposed, progressive challenger comes in, and within a year, he's, APAC funded and stuff like that. And so what I really want people to understand is the left is outgrowing this previous phase we've had where, we've been very far from power. The best we could do was, ask Kamala Harris if she'd let a Palestinian speak at the DNC, right? Which is a very watered down demand, but ultimately something that that was all we could ask for, right? And as we're growing our power both within and outside the Democratic Party, one, that's a good thing. We should recognize that. And two, we should also acknowledge that, like, you know, we are going to have to get better at actual politics, right? Like the political navigating of how you deal with coalitions, how you pick your battles, things of that nature. And there's going to be growing pains, right? But at the end of the day, like, these are good problems for the lefts to have because, you know, say what you will about liberals, the majority of Democratic voters favor socialism over capitalism. And that's something that, like, you know, is indicative of why we're seeing so much success. It's not like we got lucky a la AOC catching Joe Crowley sleeping in 2018. You know, we're growing because people want our ideas.
Yeah, I'm of two minds. I mean, I'm obviously trying to go into this cautiously optimistic. I'd like to see, I believe, you know, a better world is possible. No matter how many times people tell me I'm naive and silly. But I obviously have seen so many times these movements kind of fall on their face. Whether it's sabotage from the outside or in the inside, there's still a lot of challenges here. So I'm just constantly ping-ponging between, like, no, this is just another in a long line of, I mean, just in my lifetime, I mean, the left just didn't exist. It wasn't a thing. I'm 36. You know, it kind of started to reemerge, or not even reemerge, because I think a lot of left institutions were basically just hollowed out and went away. But you know, that sentiment started to kind of reemerge, maybe with Occupy movements for the first time, and since then we've just seen a crushing of these left movements over and over. And so I'm like, is this just another in a long line, or is what I'm seeing a logical progression here of movements kind of building on one another? And out of Occupy sentiment, you get two Bernie Sanders campaigns that really awaken people. You get AOC and the Squad, and that all kind of finally leads to Zoran Mamdani and this kind of new wave of, and Zoran is getting the lion's share of all this press right now, and it is a massive thing. But yes, there's all kinds of either people who have won or people running, and it is very impressive to see. So it's I'm hoping it's the latter. I'm hoping that this is all just building on top of each other.
Yeah. And one thing I think, like, you're absolutely right? Like somebody who, remembers Occupy, remembers, as you said, Bernie Sanders getting rat fucked twice, things of that nature, right? AOC, I'm a fan of hers, but I have many critiques. I think over the past couple of years, she's made some decisions I wouldn't make and said stuff I wouldn't do and stuff like that. And I do think that stuff is kind of a consequence of the fact that in those cases, like, the left was kind of punching above their weight, right? Just because we didn't have, mass support for like a Bernie Sanders campaign, right? You don't have the Squad in Congress in 2016. You don't have Democrats really endorsing Bernie. You don't have, a block of people who are able to kind of hear the media narratives and from a left perspective say, like, oh, I've heard this one before. I know why that's wrong. You don't have any allies in the institutions. So pretty much everything came back against Bernie Sanders, right? And that's not to say that it was wrong for Bernie to run or anything like that, because I do think, a lot of us aren't. I'm probably not sitting here talking to you if Bernie Sanders doesn't run for president, right? That is definitely a motivation that got me in. And so while I do understand like people's frustrations, and I'm not even saying you feel this way, but I do think, like, the people who are like, well, we tried presidential runs, we tried campaigns, it didn't work. It's like, yes, we did, but we tried like what effectively were Hail Marys, right? If we're being honest, like Bernie Sanders, a democratic socialist running for president of the United States in a very capitalist country was a Hail Mary. And he got really far, right? And, to stick with the football analogy, a Hail Mary is when you're like on the 30-yard line, on your own 30-yard line, and you got to just chuck it into the end zone and hope it catches, as opposed to a let's call it more concrete offense where you're running the ball down the field, getting first downs, and setting up plays. And I think as the left is evolving, we're getting into that where we're moving the ball, we're advancing, we're building allies and stuff like that. And I do think that like this is kind of a new and exciting time for leftist politics.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, you make a good point about the people who are sitting there going, I've seen this before. I think it speaks to the fact that it's got to be more than just winning this time. I mean, okay, Zoran won. He's now got to deliver, which is a difficult thing to do. Do you think that's something he can actually do within New York, or are we going to see kind of a, if we don't see kind of a marked difference in people's lives in New York City, I do think people will kind of view it as a failure.
Yeah. That's one thing I'm worried about, right? Like,
right. Cause he's still operating in this capitalist system. It's not like he now has a social democrat system that he's now in charge of.
Right. Yeah. It's not like he walks into the mayor's office and switches the lever from capitalism to socialism. And we all get, well, I mean, he's only in New York. Every New Yorker gets, healthcare and stuff like that. Right. And I do think that's like another problem that the left has to get good at. It's like, okay, you have a socialist, right? Somebody who meets my definition of socialist, which is somebody who wants to transfer the economy from one of private, I'd call it authoritarian control, to democratic control in which the collective owns the means of production, right? But how do you do that in a economy and a political system where you don't have the power to do that, right? And so there's always going to be tension there, right? There's going to be friction. As for whether or not he can deliver on his programs, I think he can, but I do think this is, again, another area where we have to realize that campaigning and protesting and activism and all the other activities that the left has gotten really good at over the past 2 decades, like, is actually very different from running an administration and doing politics, right? So, there's a lot of frustration with Zoran and specifically AOC right now because, one, they're keeping on Zoran is keeping on the New York police commissioner, I can't remember her first name. Jessica Tisch, thank you, right, who, is a Zionist, is not someone I would really want in my administration. And then also Zoran has discouraged Chiosei from running against Hakeem Jeffries, right, the House leader. Now, like, I think if we just take like our typical outside view that, leftists have the only thing we've been able to use for so long, which is, outside of power, not having the ability to build coalitions or to have to make uncomfortable choices, it's easy to say like, okay, sell out, like he, threw us under the bus, didn't even get inaugurated before he's already turning his back on the movement and stuff like that. But I don't think that's the case. I think what happened is, like you were saying, this is not a social democratic system. Leftists do not occupy the New York political machine and things like that. So in order to make this affordability agenda work in New York City, he has to cut deals, right? In my opinion, a lot of this is conjecture, so everybody is free to make their own decision. I think keeping on Tisch was an olive branch to the New York Police Department because, one thing we do need to keep in mind is the NYPD really sank Bill de Blasio's administration, right? Famous video of them turning their back on him. They would talk bad stuff about him in the press all the time. They would not respond to calls, right? Which, of course, drives up crime statistics and leads to problematic headlines for the mayor. That actually happened, right? So I wish that we had a system in which the police did not have that much cultural power, did not have that much political power, but they do. And so I am kind of sitting here like, okay, if keeping Tisch on is the olive branch you can extend to the NYPD to make them not sabotage the administration and get, not only the affordability agenda for the people of New York City who desperately need it, but a solid win for what has really is going to be used as a test case for leftist politics going forward. And I see it a little bit similar with the primary of Hakeem Jeffries. I think probably Zoran and Jeffries struck a deal where if he got, they would exchange an endorsement from Jeffries in exchange for not endorsing somebody running against Jeffries. And then also all of Zoran's policies depend on Kathy Hochul raising, that's the New York State governor, raising state taxes on the rich to fund these programs. And so I do think like this is what politics looks like, right? We fought real hard to get Zoran into office, fought real hard to get AOC into office. And this is what it is. And we do need to have a more political focused mindset as opposed to in my opinion, what is a more activist one.
Yeah, I think this kind of lays bare another issue here. On the left, I think Zoran and leftist candidates like him are going to constantly be battling not just the centrist wing of the Democratic Party and Republicans, but also leftists sometimes, where, I mean, even during the campaign, you saw, because I think it was post the primary, after the primary, he had started alluding to the fact that he was open to keeping Jessica Tisch on, and people were very upset about that. On the left, he was also contending with the accusations of him moderating on some of his anti-Zionist principles because the guy was trotted out on every mainstream news show and made to defend the whole globalize the intifada thing, and finally capitulated a little bit and said, sure, I'm not going to, that's not something I'm interested in talking about. So that whole wing is another thing he's contending with, of people thinking, oh, well, now I don't know who this guy is. I don't know if I can even trust his like leftist bona fides anymore. And all the while you have people who are going, no, trust this guy. He's, I think he's the real deal. And I want him to be successful, and I want to give him all that grace. But then there's also this thing of I'm like, well, I don't want to sound like the guy during Obama's first term who was going, oh, well, just give him till his second term. He's got to make everyone happy. He's got to worry about reelection. He's got to play politics. And I'm like, what is me, coping for the leftist politician I liked and frankly helped elect. I live in Los Angeles, but I spend a great deal of time in New York, and I did a lot of canvassing for him and stuff. And I'm thrilled he won. I did my best to make sure it happened. But how do leftists kind of walk that line of being clear-eyed about what needs to happen while also being supportive of this guy who needs to be successful?
Definitely. It's a difficult one, right? And, it goes back to the fact where, well, why is Zoran if we're going to look back in 2 years and like the amount of just racism leveled at him by everyone, right? You had Kristen Gillibrand, the head of the Democratic, Senate committee, who is actually Zoran Mamdani's senator, right? He is her constituent, like saying like he called for global jihad against Jews, like stuff where like I was shocked, right? And he's like, yeah. And he's like being asked to answer for, apparently if you're, and one thing to keep in mind is Zoran did not run for New York City mayor on a pro-Palestine platform. He ran on an affordability platform, and people thought they could sink him over his support for Palestine. And he just answered questions, right? I don't think he's ever, somebody asks him, why are you running for New York? What are you focused on? And he says, stopping the genocide or stuff like that. Not because I think he's opposed to it, just because that's not within the purview of the mayor of New York City, right? And so it's a delicate line to cross. And I want to be clear, I'm not someone who says, don't criticize Zoran, AOC, any of my politicians. I actually think criticism works. And a good example of this is, I can't remember if it was before the primary or after, but, Zoran got pressed by some media on, I almost said, does New York have the right to exist? Which would have been a reasonable question for the New York mayor. They asked him, does Israel have a right to exist? Which is a very unreasonable question for the New York mayor. And he said, he's on the spot. He says yes, right? He gets a lot of criticism from DSA over that. And he admits this, thanks people for their criticism, and comes back with a much better answer, which is when he's on the debate stage and he's asked, does Israel have a right to exist? He says, Israel has a right to exist if it follows international law and becomes a democratic state, right? And so that answer is much more in line with DSA's values and my values as a leftist. And two, it's also great because I think for the first time, people listening to this debate said, like, what do you mean Israel isn't a democratic state? Like, why can't Palestinians under, occupation vote? And it was educational. It communicated our position very well. And that's a product of criticism, right? Of constructive criticism. Now, the other side of that line is saying, like, okay, Zoran Madani is, the media puts up this obstacle course of, does Israel have a right to exist, globalize the Intifada, whatever. And he falters and says, Israel has a right to exist, right? The other side of that line is like, oh, well, Zoran's a sellout. He's a Zionist now, right? Which I think is, one, just not true. And two, a really bad way to conduct politics, right? We, as leftists, are constantly acknowledging things about how the Democratic Party is not democratic, how the media shapes narratives and distorts the truth, how they slander progressive candidates, all this stuff. And then when a leftist enters that space and tries to reconcile with these forces or fight against them, of course, they're not going to do it perfectly, right? They have a monumentous challenge. And then we get mad at them the first time they falter during that challenge. Well, that's a good way to, one, either have no one run for office, or two, push anybody who does get elected into office into the arms of, like, the centrist Democrats, right? Who are saying they're like, oh, just admit you were wrong, take this AIPAC money, and we can all be friends, right? And I'm not saying that Zoran or AOC really have done that, right? But we do need to recognize, like, yeah, we spend all this time talking about how the systems are stacked against us, and then when someone tries to enter the system for the purpose of changing it, we kind of over-critique them on, not navigating a very difficult challenge perfectly. And it's a difficult line, like you said. My rule of thumb is, whenever I hear a statement or a label I disagree with, right, asking yourself, like, okay, what else is going on in this conversation, right? Because too often we treat it as, like, you ask me a question on this podcast and I say, like, of course Israel has a right to exist, right? You would be right in thinking, okay, Joe's a Zionist, he thinks Israel is great. But, within different conditions of a campaign and, different pressures and stuff like that, I can understand why Zoran faltered at that moment. And it was constructive criticism that brought it to a better part.
And there's obviously, people are going to have to make the distinctions between legitimate criticism and just kind of crazy criticisms. I always found the Zionist accusation just misguided. I mean, you're talking about a guy who has been focused on this issue for a very long time, started his Students for Justice in Palestine chapter at his college, has just been, I mean, even when all this is going on Fox News and kind of refusing to say that Hamas should lay down their weapons and all this stuff. So it just felt out of hand. I think I do want to be fair to him with the Jessica Tisch thing. If people aren't following this closely, she is, as Joe was saying, she's, comes from a billionaire family, pretty ultra Zionist. Even very recently, if you had heard about those ICE raids on Canal Street in New York, she had said that she was not going to, or she was going to instruct the NYPD to leave ICE alone and let them come in and do what ICE does, harass immigrants, anyone who looks brown, also played a big role in trying to shut down campus protests that were supportive of Palestine. But to be fair to Zoran, he wasn't really running a campaign on police reform. That wasn't a huge part of his platform. And I do want to point that out. And I think that's kind of part of his political calculation there, because I think that's an extremely difficult thing to do. And he probably knows that. And so, yeah, I don't think this is a kind of backtracking of his ideals.
The other thing I'll say about Tish, and this is not to defend her at all, but I do think it's worth calling out that, like, she's not was never a cop, right? She is like a political operator. I think she used to run like the sanitation department or something like that. And so people point to like her billionaire family, and honestly, I take a look at her and I'm like, okay, people put her in her administration because they, want billionaire support and probably her family's money, right? And so kind of and so this is not to I would be a lot more alarmed if he was like, I'm keeping on Eric Adams, right? But I do kind of see someone in Tish who was like, a cynic, right? Like, who is in for her own motivation, right? And someone who Zoran could have had a conversation with. Again, this is conjecture. I don't know this, but said like, hey, I can keep you on this job, but like, this is kind of what we're going with now, right? And I don't know, she seems like the type of person who's more concerned with her career than like actually defending like or instituting like the kind of what Eric Adams is, which is like the cops are just all special boys who can do no wrong, and we all have to expect the responsibility. And again, right, this is conjecture. In a year, we can look back on this and judge, right? If Jessica Tish is sending the NYPD to harass people because they tweeted Free Palestine, right? Then that's absolutely fair to criticize Zoran in that regard. I just think it's a little early for people to be like, sell out, fed, that sort of stuff.
Sure. And I mean, there's a world where he's giving her the opportunity to hang herself because if he on day one says, she doesn't have a place in my administration. And then every headline in New York is just talking about how, Zoran's an idiot and a traitor and all these things. Or he lets her kind of do some of these things she's done and generate some real public opinion behind getting rid of her, then that's a completely different story. So yeah, we're going to find out. I did want to ask you about kind of, we've been kind of dancing around this topic of people's disappointment with getting more progressive candidates in office and not seeing the change they were hoping for. And I think a lot of that kind of has to do with, I don't necessarily blame them. I think they get kind of sucked up into this Democratic Party machine and realize they don't have a lot of room to maneuver in there. And a lot of the energy we're seeing right now seems to continue down this path of, you're seeing a lot of people enter races as Democrats, even though they probably, in other countries, they would probably be in different parties, I would say. And I mean, there are so many I can't even keep track of. It's like every day there is a new person dropping with a Zoran style video, being like, talking directly to camera. Hey, are things too expensive for you? And I wanted to know what you think about this strategy of doing this kind of Democratic Party insurgency where you try to kind of infiltrate them and drag them to the left. And if you think that's a successful route, or if you think there should be more of a third party effort, because I don't know where I land on this. I mean, I think I've seen a lot of failure of trying to work within the Democratic Party, and we will see how this latest wave does. Obviously, we haven't seen any success on a third party level. So, I mean, but it's, at a certain point, I don't know what's left.
Yeah. So this is actually like something DSA grapples with a lot, right? The concept of, do you run independents? Do you run on a third party ballot line, such as, should DSA become a political party? Do you run as independents? Do you run as a working families party candidate, right? And so DSA, I hate to say we're exclusive to this strategy because we're not, right? But we do take an entryist position, right? Which is having candidates such as Zoran Mamdani run as Democrats, right? As opposed to running as an independent or running as a third party challenger, right? My personal take on this is socialists should run in the Democratic Party. They should run as an independent. They should run as whoever to maximize their chances of winning, right? And I'll give you an example is if Zoran Mamdani runs as an independent and doesn't contest against Andrew Cuomo in the primary, I don't think he's mayor of New York, right? I think he is, it's Andrew Cuomo versus Curtis Siwa. And, Zoran gets 0.9% along with the other, people who ran on the kill all rats party or whatever gets added there, right? And so this is a case where, objectively entryism worked, right? And he got into, by running as a Democrat, he got the nomination and then he got elected mayor. Of course, that comes with trade-offs such as, as I was mentioning, I do think he is playing the game with not endorsing a candidate against Hakeem Jeffries. But in my opinion, like, that's still a win, right? And someone can say, well, if he ran as an independent, he wouldn't have to do that. If he ran as an independent, he wouldn't be here. So, like, that's not even a non-starter for me.
I know, it's this strange chicken or egg thing. It's like, you know, you almost have no shot as a third party outsider trying to break through. But if you enter into the Democratic machine, you step into this vacuum where you're just you try to operate among this machine that you're just not welcome in.
Yeah, and that's like that's its own fight on its own, right? So like it is kind of like a trade-off of like if you run as an independent, your election is way harder. Maybe I'm also not convinced though if like an independent gets in there and he's a socialist, like the Democratic machine doesn't also try and kill him, right?
True.
One thing I really thought that was great was when after Zoran won the nomination, he always referred to like Andrew Cuomo as like, well, this outsider is trying to corrupt our party, and being like, I am in the Democratic Party. I am the Democratic, like, and I honestly thought that was like a rhetorical device to like beat back on Kathy Hochul and remind her like, hey, I'm the Democrat. It's me and you versus him, right? Because that's how the normal person sees it. Of course, that's not how the Democratic Party sees it, because Chuck Schumer obviously voted for Andrew Cuomo, right? And I bet a lot of them did. But that's how the public understands it, right? And I think a big question where, Americans have to differentiate themselves from other countries with left-wing parties is that we do not have proportional representation, right? So let's take it, the United Kingdom, you can find like one really big left-wing area and you can run someone in, Jeremy Corbyn's new party, right? And you can win that MP seat and then you can join a coalitional government where you join and you get stuff in exchange. We don't really have that in the United States, right? Like, even if that happens, you are one independent congressperson, right, with a bunch of Democrats and a bunch of Republicans who...
Yeah, I mean, Bernie Sanders is a perfect example. He's he runs as an independent every year. He did enter 2 Democratic primaries, but just because he probably knew that there was no shot as running as an independent. But yes, he's an independent who caucuses with the Democrats.
Definitely, yeah. And like, you just have way less power in this system. And the other thing we do have to grapple with is, the Democrats, I'm not a Green Party member. I have different strategy views than them, but they are right that the Democrats just sue them off the ballot, right? And so when you're running in a Democratic primary, you're going to face other, Democratic challenges, but at least you're in the fight, right? And I'm a lot less concerned with, whether or not somebody has a D next to their name when they run, like kind of that just doesn't make too much sense to me. I'm much more focused on what they're actually going to do with their power and once they're in office, right? And so I think it's like always a different debate. And one thing I think is interesting is that, this past election cycle, the Communist Party of USA adopted the entryist strategy, right? They were always for a long time like, there's a whole history of the American Communist Party, but like they like, so for the most part, support Democrats in like a coalitional type of framing, but they have never run as Democrats before. And this cycle, they did run as Democrats and had some success, right? And I think that's, if that person runs as a Communist Party member, did they win? No. They run as a Democrat, they won, and now there's a communist in power, right? Like, that's great. We should be trying to find more ways to get into power.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably a perfect time to talk about this this divide and this kind of battle that's raging, because we're obviously going to see it pop up in the midterms, but, those are going to be fought out in smaller individual primaries. I think when 2028 really ramps up, it's going to be this kind of centrist versus more progressive, more left ideals, whether it's, kind of abundocrats and I'm glad you're here because you really I see you get in the trenches on correcting the record on people like Ezra Klein and some of these people in that
Try
which is great because I think they've really captured Ezra Klein is probably the most popular and influential thought leader right now, and it's very unfortunate, especially watching him I don't know how he hasn't just been kind of laughed out of the New York Times at this point. I mean, the way he just continues to say things that get debunked or just completely incongruous with what actually happened. But yeah, I mean, I'm very curious where we end up. I'm obviously, my biggest fear is that this is all for naught, and we get in 2028. They're telling you, hey, now is not the time for big swings. We're doing Pete Buttigieg, and we got Medicare for all who want it, and or it's Josh Shapiro. But obviously, I have high hopes for that. This has maybe opened a lane for people. This latest round of elections.
I think it's important to clarify, like, Ezra Klein and, the kind of centrist blogosphere I spent a lot of time writing about is, one, there was a new report in Axios where Ezra Klein is effectively a Democratic consultant at this point, where he's going to their meetings, he's meeting with all their 2028 presidential hopefuls, stuff like that, particularly Josh Shapiro, they mentioned. And so people always ask her, like, why are you so focused on, this one pundit, this one guy? And first is I'm a nerd and I've been reading these guys like for way too long. And so it's in my brain. And second is because these are the thought leaders of the Democratic Party, right? Ezra Klein was the guest of honor at the Senate's one-day kitchen tables retreat. And they just talked about abundance, right? Matt Iglesias was read in the Biden White House. He, bragged about having phone calls with Janet Yellen, Biden's Treasury Secretary, and discussing monetary policy. And of course, inflation, which is downstream of monetary policy, not 100%, but it certainly impacts it, was one of the reasons the Democrats lost this last election, right? And so these aren't just guys like posting on Substack. Like when they write this stuff, Democratic senators, congresspeople, staffers read it and say, we should do this. And so that's why I focus on them a lot, is because I want to kind of show that, like, one, I think their ideas are wrong, and two, they are actually having outsized influence on the Democratic Party, right? That's why I focus a lot. I also think it's important to clarify, like, Ezra Klein gets blowback, not really even from people like me, but from people who have been reading Ezra Klein for 10 years and are like, why are you saying we should run anti-choice candidates in Missouri when Missouri just like voted overwhelmingly for a pro-choice constitutional amendment, right? Like stuff like that. And I really do think it's because, the 2024 loss like really broke what was the centrist Democrats' bargain to people, right? For so long, the Democratic Party, or let me put it this way, since really Reagan broke the New Deal coalition and we got Clinton, Obama, etc., the argument for these type of politicians is that, hey, the number one thing is blocking Republican fascism, right? These guys are freaks. They want to, if your daughter is raped, they want you to make her carry her rapist baby to term. They want to get us into foreign wars, stuff like that. And I do want to admit, that is not, I can see why the average American takes that deal. Like, the Republican Party is fucking insane. Like, we do not talk about how crazy it is that we're just apparently killing people for voting in the Caribbean right now. Like, this is ridiculous, right? These are like freaks. And so I do think the average American goes like, yeah, I want to play it safe and make sure they can keep these guys out of power. 2016, I think we can really, I wouldn't call it a fluke, but it was easy to see like, okay, they snuck one in, right? Didn't win the popular vote. Something like 20,000 people vote a different way in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, etc. We have President Hillary Clinton instead of Donald Trump, right? But when 2024, when all these centrists were super excited about Biden and then over the top on Kamala Harris, right? Jonathan Chait writing, centrism is working, don't critique it. Matt Iglesias saying the only thing he doesn't like about the Democratic National Convention is that he likes it too much, right? They were like convinced, like, hey, we got it. Trump is done. We're back. We're the normal people. We're the respectable adults. And then they fucking lost. And they lost all swing states. They no longer have the House of Representatives or the Senate, right? They got their ass kicked by the people who they've been telling themselves like, oh, it was just a fluke that Trump got in there. And so now they're in panic mode, right? They don't know what to do because you can't really say like, we need to centrism even harder. So they're saying, well, that's what they are saying. Like they're getting to ridiculous places where it's like, okay, we need to give up on abortion because they don't want to give up neoliberal free market economics, because if they give that up and the Democratic Party moves to a Bernie Sanders, type position, Ezra Klein is no longer the thought leader of the Democratic Party, right? That shifts to David Sirota, Matt Bruenig, someone like that, a leftist. And so we do have to recognize that these people are fighting for their jobs. They're fighting for their influence. They're fighting for their money. And they're actually, willing to increase the chances we have to deal with President J.D. Vance and Vice President Candace Owens because they would rather cling to power. And that's a human thing, right? It's, what's the saying from the Bible? Like, devil would rather reign in hell than serve in heaven, right? Like, this isn't really a new concept. It's pretty well established. So I do think that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah. There's also been a great deal of, there was a great deal of gaslighting in the election, and there's been a great deal of gaslighting post-election. I mean, during the election, it was this thing where they were dead set on convincing you that no matter how immiserated you are or how economically, in dire straits you are, the economy is actually great, and you just can't feel it. You can't see these intangible economic indicators that we use. Just shut up and vote for the Democratic Party. We know what we're doing. And then post the election, there's been this thing of we tried the left's way. We said, we let Kamala run her like wild leftist campaign. I've seen this from people like Rahm Emanuel. They're trying to tell people like, look, we did it. Like Kamala was basically Bernie Sanders, and it didn't work.
Communist a lot, yeah. Comrade Kamala,
yeah. And so it's this challenge where I don't even think people are going to be able to have a real picture of what actually happened. They're going to completely rewrite history on this, and I really hope we can learn the lessons. I don't know if you saw this video where Zoran Mamdani. Do you remember the old video he did? I think it was the first video he did. I think it was post-election. He goes somewhere, maybe in Queens, and he's asking people if they voted, how they voted, why. Yes, he went back to the same spot a couple days before the election, I think, and he's sitting out there and asking people questions, but everyone knows him obviously, and is like freaky, like, oh my God, I love you. And I actually posted about it, and it went kind of viral because I was like, I hope people pay attention to this. Like, this is the difference between giving people something to vote against, like what you were talking about, of every election, they say the same thing. This is the most important election of your life. You cannot fuck this up. Like, if you fuck this up, these Republican freaks are
fuck this up. Right. If you, the voter, fuck this up. Yeah, right?
I mean, it's always
you stupid peasants. Yeah.
It really is. It's always laid at the feet of voters. It's still to this day, like, every time Trump does something, there's some smarmy lib going like, are you happy you stayed home? Are you happy that you, and it's never, why did you not work harder to win these people? Why, like, this election, more than anything, there were people who were going, I am going to have a very hard time voting for someone who cannot take a firm stand against genocide. And they were like, sorry, this is the best we can do. We can commit to genociding slightly less harder. And so, yeah, I hope they can harness this power of giving people material things to vote for.
You're right. People vote for stuff. And I do think, the centrist tendency, right? They all work for think tanks. They all will like conduct these polls that kind of reaffirm their narrative. But at the end of the day, people aren't data points, right? It puts me up a wall when we do this kind of pundits thing where we list 20 issues, right? Pull everybody on them, and it's like, okay, these people want more gun control, these people want stricter immigration laws, etc. And so you just need to be in the middle of all of that, right? And I think that's not how humans operate, right? like people, one, prioritize different things differently, and two, I do think that the average American, well, actually, let me put it this way. I think that the last 1 year of politics have shown us and proved beyond a reasonable doubt is that the political class is not as smart as they think they are. And the common American is way smarter than they thought they were. And I think people know when you're trying to pull one over on them. And so, yeah, you can try and navigate the center of like everyone's different issues. But like, if you're still saying, we can do this with the economy or with Gaza, right? If you're still saying, oh no, Israel is defending itself. And they're like, well, I just saw on, Facebook a video of them dropping a Hellfire missile on a tent. And I might not know the history of the whole region. I might not, like whatever it is, but I know that's not self-defense, right? And like you were saying about the charts and the economy, it's like people are like, well, actually, like gross domestic product per capita is up, and it's like, okay, cool. I'm not feeling that, and that's because one, like these metrics are more often than not medians and averages, and two, they're not taking into effect the fact that we have so much wealth inequality that yeah, GDP per capita might be going up, but I have to use those whatever those payment plans are and take on more credit debt to buy all the things in the consumer price index, right? So like yeah, like the consumer price index is just how we measure like a basket of typical shopping goods, right? And so you might say like, yeah, cool, the CPI hasn't changed too much, but like I'm paying 10% interest to afford it, right? And so getting back to like, oh, we just need to like center harder. I think these people are missing so much of the point where Americans aren't doing this anymore. For one reason or another, they're not going with like, oh, cool, we're going to show you this graph and you're going to come vote for us because it says stuff is better. Like they're like, you're lying to me. I know you're lying to me. You know you're lying to me. And I'm not showing up even if I don't like the other guy. And I can write, as a political nerd, like I'll write long articles about why I think leftists should, enter coalitional governments with centrist Democrats, when to do that, when not to do that. At the end of the day, I think the average person was like, I really just can't vote for somebody who's bombing refugee camps. And they stayed home and they lost. And I think if they just keep doing more of this technocratic bullshit, no matter what their policies are, it's not going to work.
Yeah, part of my big concern too here is I don't think they quite grasp the gamble they're dealing with here, because I think there is their refusal to engage with meaningful changes to people's lives, I think is leaving a massive lane open for people on the right to enter these spaces. So you're seeing it already with people like Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes. It's very unfortunate because you'll see clips now of Tucker Carlson talking about, honestly, affordability, talking about the health of this nation should be measured by the fact that a 27-year-old can no longer purchase a home, and that's going to be a compelling argument for voters. And if you don't have a way to bring those voters in, they're going to go that way, which is also going to be, when you don't just see the clip and you listen to the rest of the speech, there's a lot of like horrifying things about how it's actually Muslims and immigrants who are to blame for this or whatever. So if you're not bringing them in a way that kind of engages with universalism and a way to take care of people in a way that's not filled with hate and nativism, you're opening a scary situation.
Yeah. And it's like this timeless, rule. Bad plan beats no plan, right? They're probably not reading the Financial Times, but they're like, hey, it's getting harder and harder to like put food on the table, to pay rent, or even like the bills are going up, right? And I have less money. They notice that. And so when you have one candidate like JD Vance who's like, the reason grocery prices are high is because, 30 million illegal Mexican rapists are, stealing eggs off of farms. It's the cartel egg thief gang or whatever. And then you have a Democrat who's like, actually, it's fine. Joe Biden is the best president ever. He's the most progressive president. You lazy fucks don't know how you should be like kissing our feet. Like, they're going with the bad option. I use this metaphor right after the election, but like, if you're drowning, your family's drowning, somebody tells you, no, you're not drowning, just learn how to swim, go for it, and somebody else throws you like an anchor, you're going to grab the anchor, right? Just because it's something. You're panicking, you're going down, you'll take whatever you can get, right? And that is, unfortunately, the dynamic that I think the Democrats have offered, which is like, it gets cliche, status quo, we're the adults in the room. And a lot of people are like, status quo is not working for me. Like, and you can keep showing me graphs that I'm wrong. I'm telling you, like, your graphs are wrong. My life is getting harder. Like, yeah. And that's just the nature of technocracy where, so many times the people in the, who run the Democratic Party, like, miss the forest with the trees, right? Where they're saying, and I think this is a lot with like them saying like, oh, we need to moderate to win. We need to moderate to win the Senate. And they have all these like charts and studies, which I spend a lot of time debunking on my Substack. But at the end of the day, right, all that information should be educating us on how to win elections, right? And centrists, as evidenced by the fact that Donald Trump is the president and the Republicans control both houses of Congress, don't win elections, right? And so you can have all your graphs saying, we get plus 1.2 points here. You've majored in the minors and you've forgotten that you lost election, right? It reminds me so much of going back to football when people will be like, I'm a Patriots fan, so I'm going to offend some people here, but like, Aaron Rodgers is better than Tom Brady because Aaron Rodgers has more like 300-yard passing games in the playoffs. And it's like, yeah, but Tom Brady won fucking Super Bowls, right? That's the job of a quarterback. And sorry, I am glazing Tom Brady here, but that is what it is. And like when people come back and they're like, I have all these charts that say like the economy is good, and then someone tells you the economy is not good and votes as if the economy is bad, that's probably because the economy is bad for them. So
yeah, I mean, they seem almost willfully blind too, and I'd love to actually just quickly try to go through some of their views here. So if the audience isn't familiar at all, they can kind of understand what we're talking about a little bit. I just wanted to get because I know you've dug into this a little bit. You're familiar with the Deciding to Win paper they put out. So this was kind of the work of a bunch of more centrist, more in the middle Democrats who are, as everyone is, wondering where do we go next? What is the game plan going to be? And they put out this whole thing called Deciding to Win, and it really illustrates this divide, and also maybe the cynical nature of some of these people. I think, I mean, we'll get into it, but I think a lot of the stuff is just flat out wrong. I mean, they start saying what we need to do is focus our policy agenda and our messaging on an economic program centered on lowering costs, growing the economy, creating jobs, and expanding the social safety net. Right off the bat, I'm like, wow, okay, incredible. These guys are getting it. This is unbelievable.
We did it.
and then you get into it and they're like, we're going to advocate for popular economic policies, e.g. expanding prescription drug price negotiation, making the wealthy pay their fair share in taxes, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, rather than unpopular economic policies, e.g. student loan forgiveness, electric vehicle subsidies, and Medicare for all. And I was that one right off the bat, I was like, they're going to release this paper and try to make, the polling on Medicare for all for the past decade, at least, has been overwhelmingly positive. That was always the thing. I mean, some polls are as high as like 80% of Democrats are for this. The party has always been behind the ball on this. And now they have new data that apparently it's actually really unpopular and people don't like when you talk about giving them healthcare.
Yeah, this is like, I mean, to go into this thing, it is one, I do think it's worth calling out. They always start with like progressive language, right? Like you said, like, hey guys, we're on your side. We want like worker protections and stuff like that. Unfortunately, we have to be the adults in the room and tell you it's not possible. I think Medicare for all is it's the litmus test to tell whether or not someone is actually putting forth, the argument from these folks is always the most important thing is winning elections. We need to do what voters want us to do. We need to put aside leftist ideology and deliver what people want. You can tell if somebody's serious and how they talk about Medicare for all, right?
Oh, it's the first thing. It's the first thing I look for when a new candidate comes out. It's the first thing I go to their policies page and I'm like, do they or do they not support Medicare for all?
Yeah, right. And like you said, this is not really like there's multiple polls showing this. The Economist says 60% of Americans think we should have Medicare for all. It's like a third of Republicans and like 57% of independents, right? So if you're looking for an issue to galvanize and drive people towards, like, you should do that, right? To kind of, I'm not sure if you're getting there, but to kind of cut ahead, like how they got to a negative Medicare for all is they straight up lied, right? In their questionnaire for this study, they said, they told people like, hey, Democrats in Congress are putting for Medicare for all with this tax increase. And that's not Democrats' tax increase, right? They actually took a tax increase from the Committee for a Fiscally Responsible Budget, I think is the name of the organization, which is really just a billionaire's like think tank to be like, actually, guys, we crunch the numbers and Social Security has to be cut, that type of stuff. And so what they did was they took the worst case interpretation they could find of the law, put it into a study and said, hey guys, like, oh, sorry, we can't do Medicare for all. And it is worth noting that Welcome PAC, who commissioned this study, is funded by the Walton families who own Walmart, Michael Bloomberg. One of their most frequent donors was one of the Murdochs, who, Rupert Murdoch, owner of Fox News, Wall Street Journal, right? And some drug companies, right? International pharmacies, stuff like that. People who very much do not want Medicare for all because their taxes would go up to pay for, right? And that's kind of like, I think, the crux of this, because these people can't say, no, we're not doing Medicare for all. They can't argue on a moral ground. They can't really also argue on a fiscal responsibility ground, even though they always say, like, it'll raise taxes. Every study shows that, yes, you will have to raise taxes on people, saving them more money than what they're spending on health insurance, right? We spend, I think, of the economically developed countries, we spend the most on healthcare per person, right? So we are doing the least fiscally responsible option, but it makes a lot of people money, right? And they can't argue on that behalf, so they have to present it as like, oh, the people just don't want it, right? When in fact, the opposite is true, because say what you will about politics, the one thing everybody interacts with is their doctor. They fight with their insurance companies. They have to go to the doctor. They know firsthand this system sucks and they want something different. And so I think that's a good gauge on whether or not somebody is being honest at saying like, hey, we can't do this leftist stuff. We gotta focus on what people want and winning elections, or if they're just, trying to hide a neoliberal ideology under the false veneer of pragmatism.
Yeah, it's very wild the lengths they're willing to go to try to change the narrative on this. I won't read it at all because it's very long. I just think this one is also very funny to me. It's almost incomprehensible. So this one says they need to convince voters that we share their priorities by focusing more on issues. By focusing more on issues voters do not think our party prioritizes highly enough: the economy, the cost of living, healthcare, border security, public safety. Okay, we're with you. And focusing less on issues voters think we place too much emphasis on: climate change, democracy, abortion, identity, and cultural issues. I mean, just reading this whole thing is like, what planet are you guys living on? I mean, including democracy and abortion and things that people don't care about is just absolutely crazy. I mean, you're seeing mass protests with the No Kings movement thing. People are obviously pissed about this authoritarian lean. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought abortion was like the one thing Democrats always tried to hang their hat on and force people to go out and vote with.
And also it works, right? Like, abortion rights poll higher than the Democratic Party in almost every state in the country, right? Like, if you're looking to, there's been so much talk about like, oh, well, how do we win Nebraska Senate? Like, I don't have all the answers, but throwing abortion out is not one of them. Like, people like abortion more than they like Democrats, right? And that kind of just gets to the point of these people are scrambling, right? They have nothing left to offer. So they start getting into insane stuff. As for democracy, like, I think most Americans like democracy. If you ask them, like, do you want a system in which, even what I would consider the very limited democracy we have, the managed democracy of you have to, vote for the House, the Senate, a president, like get through the filibuster, the Supreme Court has to approve it, right? People prefer that over like, hey, we're just going to have one guy who makes all the decisions. I think the reason why these guys are thrown out is because they have such a high view of themselves. They're like, well, we told people this election was about democracy, and they clearly don't care about democracy. Once again, like, these stupid plebeians don't know how great the welcome pack Niskin Center policy plan is. I think people like democracy. I want to expand democracy. That's why I'm a socialist, right? The problem is, people don't see the Democratic Party as democratic, and it's really not, everyone is kind of aware that, to different degrees, Bernie Sanders was screwed, right? Even before Trump took office, most Democrats were not happy with Biden's Gaza policy. And they were like, hey, why isn't anyone listening to us, right? We've been trying to get, popular reforms really since 2008. And all the time we have these politicians telling us, no, you can't. So Democrats say, oh, well, we're the party of democracy. But really what they are is like a technocracy where they want democracy to get them into office and then do undemocratic things, right? They want to support Israel. They want to not run on Medicare for all. They want to, handpick Kamala Harris to be like the nominee. You can't say we're for democracy and then not be democratic. That's not how it works.
This is all the most frustrating thing to me. It's the, I get a lot of pushback from people of like, you're too hard on Democrats. You don't, do you want Republicans to win? And it's like, no, I'd like them to make it easier for people to vote for them and not do these things where they make it very difficult for themselves to run as the pro-democracy party, like for all these things you're talking about. I mean, just kind of, how silly is it as you're screaming about this guy who wants to become authoritarian, where you are just completely foregoing a primary process and anointing a candidate. So yeah, they look very silly. And you brought up the socialism. I'm just going to bring up one more, and then we can move on from the deciding to win thing. But this one and I think you brought it up earlier too. They said they need to embrace a substantive and rhetorical critique of the outsized political and economic influence of lobbyists, corporations, and the ultra-wealthy, while keeping two considerations in mind. First, voters' frustrations with the status quo are not the same as a desire for socialism. And second, criticizing the status quo is a complement to advocating for popular policies on the issues that matter most to the American people, not a substitute, which is very funny. You alluded to it a little bit, but just this year, there's been polling that shocked everybody that people have a much warmer feelings for socialism than they do for capitalism at this point.
Yeah, and people endlessly argue like, what's real socialism, what's not. I have my opinions. I don't spend too much time on that. If somebody wants to call themselves a socialist, like the last thing I'm really doing is trying to like push them away, right? But I do think like, this is a backlash to so many, the last, 100 years of American politics where they're like, well, we can't have universal healthcare. That's socialism. We can't have unions. That's socialism, right? All this stuff is socialism. And then people were like, actually, sounds like I'm a socialist. Like, I think we should have all of that, right? And so they might not have, the perfect idea about, get real nerdy here, the relationships between the workers and the means of production and how that's actually the deciding factor of socialism. But they're on the right track, right? Getting people to realize the fault of capitalism is, in my opinion, the hardest part about arguing for socialism. I've routinely said, in my kind of work, explaining socialism is not the hard part. It's explaining capitalism that people don't understand, right? Where they say like, oh, capitalism is free markets, right? It's the difference between Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, stuff like that. And it's really not. That's a market, right? Capitalism really determines, who is getting the profit from that market and who is making the decisions in that market. There have been market economies in all socialist countries. There will be market economies if, my kind of dream economy comes to pass. But we are seeing people just realize, I take that as more of an indictment of the fact that they're just like, I don't like capitalism, and I've been told my whole life it's capitalism or socialism, so I guess that makes me a socialist, which is great. That's kind of where people like me and you should come in and like educate them and be like, okay, yeah, this is how this manifests in the electoral sphere. This is kind of the ideological framework we're fighting for, things like that. And you can tell, one reason, going back to how we started, which is like the left has ascended, is leftists should pay attention to how centrists and Republicans treat us, right? This is a study commissioned that took a lot of money pushing back on modern progressive socialist policies, right? They don't commission that 7 years ago when, we have one congressperson, right? They are treating us like we are a political threat. And I do think we are. And I think, this is going to be, these are the fights we're going to have, right? We got to be on the watch out for this type of stuff. And it sounds like more people are coming around to our position than theirs. So,
yeah, I do think that's
kind of thrilled.
I think that's true, and I think it's a good point. I think historically, if you look at when things have been successful, everyone points to FDR, but doesn't really point out the massive kind of left project that was pushing him to the left, and that was kind of threatening their political lives. And that's really what it will take. And I think you're right. I do think for the first time they do feel a real threat. After these recent off-year elections, it did feel almost like, okay, if people like Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey, who won the governorship, are going to be talking about affordability and talking about doing a state of emergency right away to freeze your utility bill and stuff like that, I'm like, okay, we might have already won this thing. I don't want to get complacent here, but that is thrilling to see.
That was really funny to me, where like all the centrists are really mad at Zoran because obviously he's a socialist, and they're like, he's going to freeze the rent in rent stabilized apartments, which is something that happens, is within his power, right? And then the one they're all like kind of gushing over is like, I'm going to freeze everyone's utilities bill, which is a more expansive form of price control, right? Like, you would almost think those would be switched, with the socialist would be like, utilities are going to stay freeze, and the moderate comes in and is like, we'll freeze the rent on some apartments instead, just so they can stay freeze. Like, that was a pretty progressive and left economic policy that they kind of papered over because they didn't want to start talking about how Mikey Sherrill won that so well, because she wasn't saying like, we're going to cut your landlord's taxes so that your rent can go down, right? She was saying, I'm going to use the power of the state to freeze your utility bill, which is not bad in my opinion.
I think with this battle, it's going to come down to whether or not people can believe you. So it's going to be, people are going to need to see results. If you can get it done, then you can hang on to power. We don't have time to get to it today, but we'll have you back on some other time.
Gives me an excuse to come back.
yeah. We'll talk all about it. And why don't you give the people a plug where they can find your stuff? I think it's important. He's doing God's work here. Telling all the centrists to go to hell.
I'm trying. So come check me out on Substack. It's at Joe Wrote, or just joewrote.com. I'm on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok, I think, as at Joe Wrote, JoeWrote. Come hang out. Hopefully I can help us all make sense of the moment we're in and how we keep this great momentum going.
All right, great. Thanks so much for coming on, Joe.